Save $10,000 a year and your first 100,000 takes 8 years. Your second takes 5. Your third takes 4. By the 8th, it arrives in a single year. 8 years of work for the first one, 12 months for the 8th. That is what people mean when they say net worth explodes after 100,000, and the acceleration is completely real. But the 100,000 is not what caused it. That number has no power at all, and believing it does will cost you time. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance, the kind that works for normal people, instead of the kind that sells you something. No motivational fluff, no fantasy returns, no get rich quick. Just what the math actually does over time. If that is what you want, hit subscribe. The moment people are really pointing at is when your account starts earning more each year than you put into it. Somebody saving $1,200 a year hits that at $19,000. Somebody saving $24,000 a year does not hit it until $379,000, both in year 12. Always year 12. The balance moves because it scales with what you save. One number runs through everything that follows. 7% is roughly what American stocks have returned over the long run once you subtract inflation. That is what money gains in actual buying power. So why does everybody say 100,000? Take a typical American worker earning around $62,000. Vanguard's latest data says the average employee puts about 7.6% of their pay into a workplace retirement account. The median puts in 6.6, so call it 7% of their own money. Now add a common employer match, 50 cents on the dollar up to 6% of pay. The total going into the account each year is around $6,200. Now run that forward and find the moment the account starts out earning the person. It lands at $97,858. That is why everybody says 100,000. It is not a mathematical threshold. It is the median American's crossover point, rounded to a number that sounds tidy. Which means it is true for a lot of people and completely wrong for you if you save meaningfully more or less than the median. If you are putting away $15,000 a year, your real number is closer to $240,000. If you can only manage $100 a month, yours is under $20,000 and you may have already passed it without noticing. So find your own version. Take what goes into your account in a year, including any employer money, and multiply it by about 14. That is where your account starts doing more than you do. 3 things genuinely do change around this point in a financial life. None of them is an explosion. All 3 are real. The first one is the handover. Below your crossover number, you are the engine. Your discipline is what moves the balance, and the market is a passenger. Above it, that reverses permanently. For our median saver, the year they cross, the account earns about $6,600 while they contribute $6,200. It is close. But it never goes back the other way because the account keeps getting bigger, and their contribution mostly does not. That last part is the piece almost nobody mentions, and Vanguard's data shows it plainly. Workers under 25 put in about 8% of their pay. By 55 to 64, it is 12.8%. That is an entire working life of promotions and raises, and the rate moved about 4 points. People pick a percentage early and mostly never revisit it. So the handover is not really a graduation. It is what happens when one side of the equation keeps compounding and the other side stays roughly frozen. The second change is the one nobody warns you about, and it is psychological rather than mathematical. At $100,000, an ordinary market year starts moving more money than you do. A 15% year is not a dramatic year. Looking at the last century of American stock returns, more than half of all years moved 15% or more up or down. It is the middle of the pack. On $25,000, a 15% year moved $3,750. Noticeable and smaller than what you put in. On $100,000, that same ordinary year moves $15,000. That is more than double what our median saver contributes across an entire year of discipline, and it cuts both ways. Now take a 25% drop, the kind that showed up in 2008 and again in early 2020. On a $25,000 account, it removes $6,250. Off $100,000, it takes $25,000. So the real change at this number is not that your money starts working harder. It is that the market's mood starts outvoting your behavior, and you have to make peace with that. This is where people quit, not at the beginning, when nothing is happening, but here, when the swings first become large enough to frighten them. Though plenty of people quit long before that, and the numbers explain why. In year 1, our median savers account earns them nothing at all. By year 3, the market hands them about $900 for a full year of discipline, and by year 5, $1,900. That is 5 years of never missing a contribution to receive less than a third of 1 year's savings in return. Nothing about that feels like a system that works. Then look at what quitting costs. Somebody who contributes for 8 years and then stops ends up 30 years later with about $282,000. Somebody who keeps going ends with $586,000. Stopping just before the crossover is the single most expensive thing on this timeline, and it happens at the exact moment the evidence looks worst. There is a reason those early dollars carry so much weight. A $6,200 contribution made in year 1 is worth $47,000 by year 30. The identical contribution made in year 29 is worth $6,600. Same money, same account, 7 times the result. The dollars you put in during the years that feel pointless are the most valuable dollars you will ever contribute. The third change is the acceleration from the top of this video, nothing sped up at 100,000. The acceleration runs the whole time at exactly the same rate. It only becomes visible when the numbers get big enough to feel. Ask where the money in the account actually came from. When our median saver first touches 100,000, they have personally put in 74,400 of it. Growth supplied the other third. By the time the account reaches 200,000, growth is supplied 47%. By 300,000, it is 55%. So the first 100,000 is mostly your money with some help. The third 100,000 is mostly the market's money with some help from you. That is the whole story of this video in one comparison, and it explains why the early years feel so thankless. So how do you get there fast? I priced every lever against the same baseline, our median saver taking 12 years. The one that surprised me was the return. Raising it does almost nothing. At a 5% return after inflation, the first 100,000 takes 13 years. 7% brings it to 12, and 9% to 11. Across the entire realistic range of investment outcomes, the first 100,000 moves by about 2 years. Now, the contribution. Saving 4,000 a year, it takes 15 years. 6,200 brings it to 12. 10,000 a year gets you there in 8, and 15,000 in 6. 2 years from the return. 11 years from the contribution. So before you have $100,000, arguing about funds and allocations is close to a waste of your attention. What gets you there is how much goes in. This flips completely once you arrive. Take $100,000 and 20 more years of the same contributions. At 5% you end with $470,000, at 9%, $878,000. The same return range that was worth 2 years before $100,000 is worth $400,000 after it. That is the real handover. Before 100,000, you are the lever. After it, the portfolio is. Most people optimize in exactly the wrong order, which means the advice that helps you before 100,000 is almost the opposite of the advice that helps you after. Before it, ignore the fun debates and get more money in. After it, the amount going in stops mattering much and how it is invested starts deciding everything. Most people do it backwards. They obsess over allocation while the balance is too small for allocation to matter. Then they leave it alone once it is large enough to decide the outcome. The same pattern decides a question people ask constantly. What account should you use? Run our median savers 12 years, 3 ways. Through a sheltered retirement account with no tax drag, through an ordinary taxable account, and through an expensive fund charging a full %. All 3 reach 100,000 in 12 years. The timeline does not move at all. Now run the sheltered account and the taxable one out to 30 years. The gap is about $30,000. So the account you choose is worth almost nothing on the way to 100,000 and $30,000 afterwards. Set it up correctly, but do not mistake it for the obstacle. The obstacle is almost always the amount going in. Rank then. Number 1 is the employer match, and it is not close. Many employers add money to your account when you add money to it. The common arrangement is 50 cents for every dollar you put in, up to a limit. Our median saver contributing 7% with no match reaches 100,000 in 15 years. With a typical 50% match on the first 6% of pay, it takes 3 years for filling out a form. And unlike everything else on this list, that money arrives before the market does anything at all. Vanguard's data says only about 14% of participants contribute the maximum their plan allows, but the match is a far lower bar than the maximum. You only need to reach whatever percentage your employer matches to, which is commonly 6% of pay. If you do not know what your plan matches, that is the single highest value thing you can look up this week. It takes about 5 minutes and it is worth 3 years. Number 2 is your contribution rate, which sounds obvious and is worth stating in years rather than percentages. Moving from 7% of pay to 10% takes 2 years off. Moving from 7 to 15% takes 4 years off. That last one is a real sacrifice for most households, and I am not going to pretend it is easy, but 4 years is what it buys. Number 3 is a lump you already have sitting somewhere. Starting with $10,000 already invested removes 2 years. Starting with $25,000 removes 4. This matters more than it sounds because a lot of people have this money and it is doing nothing. An old workplace account from a job you left, a savings account holding far more than an emergency fund needs. Money sitting in cash after a house sale that never happened. If you have anything like that, moving it is the single fastest action on this entire list because it requires no ongoing sacrifice at all. Vanguard's data says roughly a third of people cash out their retirement account when they change jobs, so a lot of the money that would have been somebody's first $100,000 was spent years ago. At the time, it felt like a windfall rather than a withdrawal. If you left a job and never dealt with the account, that is the first place to look this week. Rolling it into an ordinary retirement account at a low-cost broker takes an afternoon and a phone call. It costs you nothing in ongoing sacrifice. Number 4 is cutting fixed costs, and I want to be precise about why fixed rather than variable. Adding $200 a month takes 3 years off the timeline, but the $200 has to be permanent, which means it needs to come from a monthly bill rather than from willpower. A cheaper insurance policy stays cheaper. A refinanced loan stays refinanced. One less car stays one less car. Skipping coffee does not stay skipped. My neighbor David is the person I think about with all of this. He is the one who taught me what he calls income first. His car is a 2014 Honda Accord with a dented bumper he has refused to fix for years. He is also far better off than most people who would look down on it. His argument is that everybody attacks the expense side because it feels controllable, and the expense side has a floor. You cannot cut your way below zero. The income side has no ceiling. The math backs him up, and it is uncomfortable. If you earn $62,000 and save 7%, getting to $100,000 takes 12 years. If you earn $80,000 and save that same 7%, changing nothing else about how you live, it takes about 9. 3 years from the raise alone with no additional discipline required. Most personal finance content will not tell you that part. A raise or a better job is harder to package than a tip about subscriptions. It is also the biggest lever most people have. Everything above has limits. The first is that these numbers all run on a smooth 7%, and the market has never delivered smooth anything. I ran every 10-year stretch in the last century of American returns. 4 out of 91 finished negative and 9 came in under 3% a year. If one of those decades lands on your first 12 years, your $100,000 arrives later and nothing about your behavior prevents it. The second is that I have been talking about a median earner, and the median is not everybody. For a household earning $30,000, 7% of pay is $175 a month. The timeline to $100,000 is not 12 years. Telling that household to simply save more is not advice, it is noise. The honest version for anyone in that position is that the income lever is not one option among several. It is the only one with enough room in it, which is exactly why David talks the way he does. One more thing. For anyone in their 50s who assumes the window has closed, the first $100,000 takes about the same 12 years whatever age you start. Somebody beginning at 25 gets there at 37. Somebody beginning at 50 gets there at 62. The clock on that first stretch does not care how old you are. What age changes is what happens afterwards. The person who arrives at 37 has 28 more years of the handover working for them and finishes above $1 million. The person who arrives at 62 has 3 years and finishes near $140,000. So starting late does not make the first $100,000 harder. It shortens the part that comes after, which is why the answer for a late starter is rarely to chase returns. It is more contribution, more working years, or a smaller number to aim at. The third is about the word explodes, which is in the title of this video and belongs in quotation marks. Nothing about this is fast, The median saver's first 100,000 takes 12 years of never stopping. The acceleration afterwards is real, but it is measured in decades. And any content that suggests otherwise is selling you something. So all of it together, $100,000 is not a magic number, but it is the typical American's crossover point, which is why it became famous. 3 things genuinely change around there. Your money starts contributing more than you do and never stops. An ordinary market year starts moving more than your annual savings in both directions. And each subsequent 100,000 arrives faster than the last. To get there quickly, the ranking runs like this: the employer match, then your contribution rate, then any lump you already have sitting idle, then permanent cuts to fixed costs. Your investment returns barely matter until you arrive, and then they become almost everything. Find your own crossover number this week. Take everything that goes into your accounts in a year, including employer money, and multiply it by 14. If that number is smaller than you expected, you are closer to the handover than you thought. And if you are already past it, the thing you have been optimizing is no longer the thing that decides your outcome. If this was worth your time, hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.